When the world is at war and children go hungry, when there is no justice, no peace, when the night is long and your heart is hurting, remember God's promise. Even when it seems like the end, all is not lost. Hold fast hope.
During last week's message, I addressed the shooting that took place in Buffalo, New York, killing 10 people, wounding 3 others, and terrorizing a community because of the hate-fueled violence of a white supremacist. While I spent more time talking about the issue of racism in our country, I also addressed the issue of gun violence in our country. I shared data from the CDC that in 2020, over 45,000 people in the U.S. died from firearms. What I didn't share last week, but feel compelled to share this week, is that in that same year, over 4,300 children, 19 and younger, died of firearms, making firearms the leading cause of death for children in the year 2020. Last Tuesday, 19 more children were added to this year's list of children killed by firearms, along with 2 of their teachers. What happened in Uvalde, Texas is unspeakable, but unfortunately it is not surprising. And that reality breaks my heart. This kind of thing happens far too often in our country, and if something doesn't change, it will happen again. In fact, according to the statistic I mentioned a moment ago, in 2020, 11 children died every day from firearms in America. While most of those deaths did not happen in schools, they are no less tragic. Another tragedy is that most of us paid very little, if any, attention to those. And if it wasn't for what happened in Uvalde, I'm not sure we'd be paying attention to the children who died last week from firearms, both at and beyond our nation's schools. Of course, by Wednesday morning, the politicians and pundits were all posting up on their side of the debate, blaming the other side for their complicity in the violence and making dire warnings of what would happen if their opponents got their way. There have been prayers offered, vigils hosted, and speeches given. This will go on for a while, but if our past is once again prelude, when it comes to this, nothing will happen. Nothing will change. And then it will happen again and we'll start the cycle all over. When will it be enough? When will we as a people say that enough is enough? Again, like I said last week, I am not claiming to know how to solve this. I have my ideas and you likely have yours, and I am confident there would be some disagreement if we were to have a conversation about this in our congregation about how we could get this done best. But we have to try something, because what we are and are not doing right now isn't working, and it's costing lives every single day. As Christians, we simply cannot sit back and allow this to continue. It's antithetical to the gospel, and it is contrary to everything we profess as a people of faith. And if we don't do something, we will only have ourselves to blame when, not if, it happens again. When we planned this series on how to find hope, no matter what happens in our lives or in the world around us, I knew that we were going to have to address some difficult topics. But nothing could have prepared us for the reality of the last couple of weeks. My original plan for today was to talk about one of the more difficult stories in the life of Elisha, a story that involves the death of a child. That sermon was almost finished by the time the story broke about the shooting in Uvalde. While I tossed that original sermon out Wednesday morning, I decided to still use the story of the young boy. It wasn't going to be an easy story to tell to begin with, but it's going to hit even harder now. That said, this story and the other one we will visit this morning have a powerful message of hope that can speak into this moment and how we move forward from it. The first story begins when the prophet Elisha was passing through a place called Shunem. and he met a wealthy woman who lived there. She offered to provide him with a meal and a bit of rest. From that day on, whenever Elisha came to that town, he would stop by her house to eat and be cared for. Eventually, the woman asked her husband if they could build a small room on their rooftop where Elisha could stay anytime he wanted. The husband agreed and the room was built. On one of his visits, Elisha decided he would do something kind for the woman to show his appreciation for all she and her husband had done. So he sent his servant to go and discover what the woman might want or need that Elisha could help provide. When the servant returned, he told Elisha that the woman had no children and that she and her husband were not able to conceive. Elisha sent for the woman, and when she arrived, he promised her that in due time she would conceive and give birth to a child. Taken aback, and not in a good way, the woman replied, "Please, sir, do not deceive me." Now, I want to pause the story here to say a quick word about infertility. My wife, Carrie, and I have experienced the pain of infertility firsthand. Our family plan was to adopt a child and then have a biological child later. What we did not know at the time we made that decision was that we would struggle to conceive a child on our own. It was an incredibly difficult time for us that was filled with tests and treatments, moments of great hope and moments of deep grief. It was one of the hardest seasons of our lives. Eventually, we were able to conceive, and our youngest child, Graham, came into the world. I want to be gentle in telling that story because I know that not every journey through infertility results in conception, and when it doesn't, the pain can be unimaginable. If you've dealt with infertility or know someone who has, you know the hope that would come with such a promise and the pain that would come if the promise was not fulfilled. That was why the woman did not cry out in joy upon hearing the proclamation that she would bear a child. For her, the words likely stung as they brought up years of suffering and grief. For the woman in this story, the journey ultimately led to a son, but her joy was only temporary because while the boy was still a child, the unimaginable happened. He was in the field one day and complained to his father that his head was hurting. They brought the boy home to his mother, but despite her care, he later died in her arms. Stricken with grief, she carried her son to the room where Elisha often stayed and laid him on the bed. Then she left and went to find the prophet. When she saw him, she fell to the ground and grabbed his feet aggressively enough that Elisha's servant thought she was trying to hurt him. But Elisha, recognizing her bitter distress, let her cling to him. As she did so, she lashed out at him in anger for using his prophetic powers to help her conceive, only to then allow her son to die. It was more than she could take. But in response, Elisha didn't immediately go to the boy himself. Instead, he asked his servant to take his staff and go lay it on the boy, which he does. Elisha's inaction made the woman angry, and she demanded that he go to the boy and do what she knew only he could do. Elisha relented and went. When they arrived, he closed the door of the room and bent over the child, covering him with his body. As he did so, the child's flesh began to warm up. Elisha got down and walked around the room for a while. Then he bent over the child again, and the boy began to sneeze, doing so 7 times, at which point he opened his eyes. Elisha then called for the woman, and she came into the room, fell once again at Elisha's feet, thanking him for the miracle of restoring her son's life. It is a dramatic story of hope gained, then lost, and then found again. It is also a story that points to another one just as dramatic. This one is found in the Gospel of John and is likely familiar to many of you. The story begins when Jesus received word from Mary and Martha that their brother Lazarus was gravely ill. They all knew that if Jesus could get there in time, he would provide a miraculous healing, and they believed he would do just that. But upon hearing about the illness, Jesus did not go to his friends. Instead, he waited for 2 days before he even started the journey to get there. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And upon seeing Jesus, Martha ran to him crying out, "If you had been here, he would have lived. You could have saved him." When reading this story, you cannot help but hear the disappointment and pain in Martha's voice. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And she replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." To which Jesus answered, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" he asked her. "Yes, I believe," she said. As they made their way toward the house, Mary saw Jesus and ran to him just as her sister Martha had done, grabbing his feet and crying out, "If you had been here, he wouldn't have died." And then she began to sob. Jesus looked at her and all those who had gathered to grieve the death of Lazarus. He saw their grief and pain. He saw their anger. And he began to weep. Jesus knew how this story was going to end. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, not only at the resurrection, but in just a few short moments. Jesus knew that this death, that any death, is not the end of the story. And yet, though Jesus knew exactly what was about to happen and the joy of hope that was about to break into this moment of despair, he was filled with grief, and tears began to fall down his face. Because sometimes, even when we know there is greater hope out there, even when we know something good is just around the corner, the pain of this moment is too much to bear. As often as I have read the stories of Elisha bringing the young boy back to life and Jesus calling Lazarus out of the tomb, they've never hit me the way they did this week. In the past, I focused more on the hope found in the lives brought back than the grief and pain that came first. This week, I've gotten stuck in the mother's grief of her son's death and the anger she felt towards Elisha for not immediately responding to her desperate cries. I've gotten stuck in the grief of Mary and Martha over their brother's death and the anger they felt toward Jesus for not responding to their desperate cries and coming soon enough to save Lazarus. I've been stuck in the moments of grief and anger found in these stories because I am absolutely stuck in the overwhelming grief and anger that has been brought about through the shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde and every other community where gun violence has taken the lives of innocent people. Every time I see a picture or a video of loved ones embracing each other in that grocery store parking lot, or a parent grieving over the death of their child, I see the mother of the boy in today's story. I see Mary and Martha falling on their knees and crying out. Every time I hear a parent or a student lashing out in anger because of what has happened and the fact that no one seems to be doing anything about it, I hear the mother lashing out at Elisha, and I hear Mary and Martha's anger at Jesus for not showing up in time. I've been stuck in these moments of grief and anger because I am in grief and anger. And I am afraid that once again, even though the entire nation and world are crying out for this to stop, those who can make a difference are going to show up late once again, if they show up at all. At the same time, even in the darkness of this moment, I can hear the voice of Jesus calling from outside of that tomb. "Rise up, Lazarus. Come out of the tomb and find life." While we cannot bring the children whose lives have been taken back to life, that does not mean that death wins. It does not mean that evil wins. We do not have to remain stuck in our tomb of darkness and despair. We can both find and restore the hope that we so desperately need. And building on that hope, we can do the things that will help make our nation and our world a better place for us and our children. But to do so, we've got to respond to Jesus' call and rise up. We've got to rise up and take action. We've got to rise up and make our voices heard. We've got to rise up to fight for and to find life. Don't let anyone tell you that we can't make a difference. Don't let anyone tell you that we can't do better when it comes to preventing deaths from gun violence. If Jesus has the power to defeat death and bring Lazarus back to life, I am confident that Jesus can give us the power to stop this flood of violence and restore the life-giving peace we all need and deserve. So let us turn our grief and our anger into action. Let us rise up and be the hands and feet of Christ in the midst of this pain and suffering. Let us bear the light of Christ into this and every darkness. And no matter what the journey may bring, let us hold fast hope, because the God we serve is a God of love. And in the end, I am absolutely confident that love will win. Amen.